anyway, Belfast is a city that means a great deal to me. And you know, it's unexpected. It's an unexpected relationship that has changed many times over the years. And it's a relationship which, to be honest, even a few years ago, if I heard a Northern Irish accent, I would feel waves of trauma because suddenly it would spark a memory of of my own rape. So thankfully, that's not the case anymore. I can hear plenty of Northern Irish accents and not have to deal with waves of nausea. But I'd like to, I suppose, in the next 15 minutes, talk about how I went on that journey from trauma to being able to hear a Northern Irish accent and be fine. But I'd first like to start with a audio clip from a radio show some of you may have heard. It's the Stephen Nolan Show, which is the most listened to radio chat show in Northern Ireland. And this was the episode that aired on April 14th, 2008.
But we're starting the programme this morning with this horrific story of a rape in Glen Forest Park. The PSNI are continuing their appeal for information on an horrific sexual assault on Saturday afternoon in broad daylight. The young girl, believed to be of Chinese appearance, in her late 20s, was approached by her attacker. He walked and talked with her through the park. He then dragged her into the bushes and carried out the assault. And if you maybe are one of the people that police think may have walked past that young woman in the company of her attacker, they would like to speak to you urgently. And if you have something you'd like to share with us here in the programme, 08459 555 678.
So that young woman of Chinese appearance was, of course, me. And I was sitting listening to that very exact clip, and in fact, the entire 30-minute radio show on a Monday afternoon, April 14th, 2008. And that was exactly 48 hours after my assault. So I can't begin to describe how surreal it is to hear less than 48 hours after you've been raped, news reports from complete strangers about something incredibly private and personal that's happened to you. There was a woman, obviously, you heard they were welcoming people to call in. The Lord Mayor of Belfast came in and said something, and lots of people called in with their view on what had happened to me. And I remember a woman called in and she said, "Oh, my heart goes out to that wee Chinese girl," me, because her life is now ruined. And I remember thinking, well, that's kind of an insult, right? And I know that comment came from a place of empathy, but at the end of the day, I was like, well, you don't know me. I mean, this is a complete stranger who doesn't know me, and she's pronouncing that my life is ruined just like that. And I think it's an incredibly damaging message to say, even though it's something that, again, comes from a place of empathy, because there are, who knows? I mean, I was listening to that radio show, and there could be many other, and there probably were many other rape victims who were listening to that radio show and were told, well, their lives were ruined because of what happened. And there are probably people listening who in the future would have been raped and would maybe think about that comment and say, well, this has happened and now my life is ruined. So I suppose I set out after that to kind of prove that my life wasn't going to be ruined by this thing that another person had done to me in a park in Glen Forest Park. So who was I before April 12th, 2008? I'm going to share my screen now. Share screen. And here's my slideshow. I loved hiking, and I worked in the film industry. So there should be a way to be able to play the entire thing. So I worked in the film industry, and that was me. I went to the Oscars in 2006. I was living in London. I had a pretty exciting and promising career as a film producer. As it's been mentioned in the introduction, I was chosen as a George Mitchell Scholar, which means that I studied in Northern Ireland. I was one of 12 Americans who was awarded this opportunity to study a postgraduate degree in Ireland. And I did that in Cork, and then I kept on getting invited to different events through the US Ireland Alliance. So I was invited to an event in April 2008, which was a series of events commemorating the 10th anniversary of the peace process in Northern Ireland. And I flew over there. I was in the middle of a whole bunch of different film stuff happening, but I took out 4 days from my schedule to fly over there. And I went to a series of gala dinners and receptions and spoke to a number of different Northern Irish politicians. And then at the end of that trip on the Saturday afternoon, I said, well, I'm going to go for a hike because I always loved hiking. Right. And that's me hiking the West Highland Way. And I remember seeing there was a kind of a hike that was described in my Lonely Planet guidebook that started in Glen Forest Park, and it was an 11-mile hike that would finish in Cave Hill. So I said to myself, okay, well, I've had a whole few busy days. I'm going to go on this hike on my own, and I am going to fly back to London the next day. And I did fly back to London, but I was a very different person. Because 10 minutes into my hike, I was approached by a young boy who said he was lost and he needed help. It was a bit strange to me because clearly I'm American. I couldn't give him any directions, but I tried. We had a very strained conversation and then we parted ways, or at least I thought we had. But he kept following me. And when I got to a much more remote area of the park, he approached me one more time, and this time he was very violent. So according to the police report, I had 39 separate injuries as results of my assault and rape, and these were bruises, cuts, and scrapes all up and down my body. But the real damage was psychological. I had severe post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, panic attacks. I couldn't step outside of my apartment without suffering from agoraphobia. You remember the whole list of impacts that Professor O'Neill listed yesterday that victims felt? Well, I felt every single one of those. And I found it difficult to trust strangers because I'd just been raped by a 15-year-old boy, and I felt like a fragile, useless shell of the person I'd once been. So just like that, my life changed suddenly and irreversibly. And in my condition, I had to stop working. I didn't work again until 2.5 years later. I had to live off of incapacity benefits, and I never regained the film producing career I had before my assault. But that is how indelibly a single act of sexual violence impacts us, not just the emotional, psychological, and physical consequences, the depression and the anxiety, but the way it affects our self-esteem, our mental well-being, our career prospects and finances, our relationships, and our family. So if you look at the statistics that were mentioned yesterday, generally say 1 in 4 women say will experience serious sexual violence. So that's 1 in 4 women. And you compound that across the population, that means a serious swathe of our population has been negatively impacted by sexual violence for years. I mean, it took me probably at least 5 years to recover, and that's a pretty fast recovery for a lot of victims. And we also know male victims. There's male victims of sexual violence as well. So it's a significant chunk of our population that is affected and feels those same feelings I went through, that fear that you're never going to be normal again, that incredible sense of loneliness and failure, and the shame if only ever people found out what happened to you. But why should we be ashamed of something which was never our fault to begin with? Of something another person decided to do to us? The very definition of sexual assault is that it didn't involve our consent. So we had nothing to do about that. We just happened to cross paths with a predator, whether that was somebody who crossed paths with us literally when we were hiking, somebody who happens to be in our family or our workplace. It was the predator's decision to do that, the perpetrator, and never anything to do with us. And that's a shift in thinking I had to take in order to do the work I now do. I had to stop caring what people thought when they learned I'd been raped, because I realized, you know what, people can think whatever they want about me, but at the end of the day, I know I did nothing wrong. And I'm not ashamed of something another person decided to do to me, because that shame is for him and him alone. So yeah, it was surreal and jarring to hear those news reports, and there were plenty of news reports about my rape. A teenager who raped an American tourist was jailed. Hunt for rapists after park assault. I later found out there was a week after my assault, a community vigil had been organized in Colin Glen Forest Park. And suddenly I'd gone from leading my own normal life to being the unnamed victim of a horrific attack everyone was talking about. And the whole time I thought, where is my voice in all of this? So really quickly, I want to go through how a victim's life is impacted. Obviously, this has been kind of described in the past by some of the other speakers, but that first disclosure is really, really important, right? I was lucky enough to call a friend, and I had a very strange experience. This is literally minutes after the attack, and I said, "Hi, how are you doing?" And she said, "Yeah, I'm okay." And I said, "Yeah, I'm not doing too well. I think I've just been raped." And the woman I called, my friend, was amazing. And she said, "Stay right on the phone. Are you safe? Talk to me and I'm going to get the police." And she called the police, and the PSNI came by 20 minutes later. And I have only good things to say about my experience with the PSNI. But it could have gone very differently if I called them my friend and it said, "I think I've just been raped," and she described what happened. And she might have said, "You know, I think you're maybe over exaggerating it. I'll just meet you for a pint tonight," right? And that difference in the reaction could have made me decide, okay, I'm never going to tell anyone again, or I will keep it to myself for a very long time. So that first disclosure is key. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations and kind of educate the larger population, other people out there, that if somebody's telling you the truth, you should listen to them. And then obviously there's the criminal justice system, and we've spoken a bit about this. The police I had great experiences with. The CPS, it took a really long time, or the public prosecution service, it took a really long time for me to find out when my trial was even happening. So it was a very anxious and panic-inducing experience for me. Um, I can talk about that more in the questions, but I was lucky, and my perpetrator was arrested, as you saw in the news reports, and then he was convicted because the very morning of the trial, I'd flown all the way over to Belfast. The very morning of the trial, I remember sitting in the room waiting for the jury to be selected, and suddenly I found out that he decided to plead guilty, and so suddenly I didn't have to testify anymore. So that was something which was kind of an extreme change of luck, and yeah, it resulted in a conviction, which meant that I was able to access the a payout from the criminal justice system, which was able to allow me to recover in a lot of ways. But that's something a lot of other victims aren't able to do because they're not able to achieve that conviction because the criminal justice system isn't able to achieve it for them. There's also employment. My employer reacted really well. And I mean, eventually my job didn't last, but at the end of the day, she was supportive. I remember speaking to HMRC and explaining to somebody, a complete stranger on the phone, why I had deserved incapacity benefit because I'd just been raped. So I broke down on the phone to that person. But at the end of the day, I got incapacity benefit. But every single one of these disclosures is necessary to access the services you need. And yet every single one of these disclosures can be incredibly humiliating and daunting for the victim. I wasn't in education at the time, but if I had been, how would my university have reacted, right? And then there's all these specialist services like Nexus. I obviously lived in London and I had a different rape crisis center, which was not very helpful, to be honest. But I survived somehow. But all of these services need to be improved and need to be attuned to the needs of victims. And then of course there's the media. And how did I feel about being called a wee Chinese girl whose life was ruined, right? That could have been incredibly damaging to me. If I'd had a different personality. And then there's personal life, which results from that. How are your relationships and your family impacted? And obviously we heard from Holly yesterday, relationships and family are impacted for years and decades afterwards. How are hopes and aspirations dampened because of an experience like this? Well, and a few things to bear in mind again, I know I'm running out of time, is that a victim's age, gender, race, and class can make a huge difference in how they're perceived and believed. And in order to share their story, it requires a huge amount of emotional labor from the victim. I started noticing a lot of other victims were coming out on social media. So I ended up undertaking PhD research on this. So I'm still very slowly doing my PhD in the London School of Economics in media and communications. So I'm looking at how rape survivors are engaging with the media as a form of activism. Started writing about it myself. And then I started something called the Clear Lines Festival in 2015. It's kind of a grassroots arts organization, and it was the UK's first festival using the arts and discussion to address sexual assault and consent. You might recognize Nina Burrows there as well because she and I founded the festival, and we ended up having to crowdfund money for it. But we ended up having a 4-day festival where hundreds of people attended, and we used comedy and theater and poetry and visual art and film to explore these experiences. And we had a Q&A afterwards, and it was all about creating a sense of community that celebrates the role of creativity and community in recovering from sexual trauma. And we still do regular events. We don't have big festivals anymore, but we had a series of London events, and we're hoping to come to Belfast. Actually, I've secured funding from the Arts Council of Northern Ireland to bring a few events around writing and literature to Belfast. So hopefully I'll be collaborating with Nexus on that in the next few months. And then I started writing, right? Because writing's always been an important part of my life for me. So I decided to write, and 5.5 years after my assault, after I'd kind of put my life back together, I realized I was finally in a position to address what had happened to me in a novel. So for me, a lot of it was about exploring the experience of my rapist, right? I didn't know him. I'll never know him. He'll always be a stranger to me. But it's strange to think that one person who single-handedly changed the course of my life will always remain a stranger to me. So I decided to take the idea of him, my rapist, and turn him into one of the protagonists in my novel. And I wanted to imagine what his life had been like, what had led him to commit the crime that then fundamentally changed the course of my life. Because unless we're willing to consider the roots of that behavior, we'll never be able to stop it from happening again in the future. So the novel, I guess it did quite well. It got translated into 10 languages. So here's some of the different covers. I ended up being invited to speak a lot in the media about it. Sorry, I think, anyway, that's me on the BBC and whatever, the Daily Mail and a number of other places. I got invited to come back to Belfast, actually, to go to Colin Glen Forest Park to film a documentary about my rape and recovery. And so that aired in 2017 on TV3. It's called Unbreakable True Lives. I got invited to speak at a TEDx conference. And in the past 4 years, all these places I've spoken, literary festivals, universities, rape crisis centers, houses of parliament, every time I speak, someone will come up to me afterwards and say, you know, what happened to me too. So I realize how prevalent this experience is. And there's a reason I call my book Dark Chapter, because it's a chapter and it's not the entire book. And it is possible for there to be bright chapters that lay ahead of us in our lives. So, for example, I was given an honorary doctorate of law by the National University of Ireland. That's me happily raising my honorary doctorate of law, and that was in 2018. I continued to come back to Northern Ireland, so that's me and Geraldine McAteer, who was the woman that organized the community vigil that took place in Colin Glen Forest Park a week after my assault, and we're now actually very good friends. That's me and Sir John Gillen, because I was happy to contribute to the Gillen Review. And then sometimes bright chapters can happen really unexpectedly. You know, for years after my assault, and probably a bit before as well, I had trouble trusting men and the idea of romance, and dating and relationships were always a terrain I never had much confidence in. So even though part of me thought it'd be nice to be a mother, I didn't really have any idea how that could possibly happen. But then at the end of 2018, I actually randomly went on a date, which wasn't that bad. Actually, it was quite nice. And then randomly, unexpectedly, a few months after that, I became pregnant. And you know, by that point, I was 40, and I realized, well, this might be my only chance to become a mother. So we had the kid, right? And now I'm the mother of a 14-year-old. And the Belfast Telegraph asked me about a year ago to write about it. So you know, it meant a lot to me to be able to write about that for the Telegraph. And that's him 14 months old now. And we go on hikes as much as we can in lockdown. So our lives are always full of unexpected developments, some good, some bad. And we might have our dark chapters, but there's also always bright chapters, because the dark chapters aren't the entire book. And because there's also a truly incredible community of survivors and supporters and activists and advocates and people like you who care about this issue and want things to change. But change can only happen if you start listening to survivors, not as the tears of poor victims whose lives are ruined, but as a community of individuals with the knowledge and the life experience to improve our public systems. Individuals who can collectively come together, share our dark chapters, and start writing a brighter and more equal chapter for the future. And if you're interested in the book, it's actually almost sold out in paperback, but you can probably find it a little bit online. But there's hardbacks available and ebooks and audiobooks. And yeah, I'd be thrilled if you wanted to read my book because it has meant a lot to me that people have read it and been impacted and affected by it. Oh, and speaking of other bright chapters, hopefully I will be coming to Belfast later on this year with this Arts Council Northern Ireland grant. So I look forward to maybe meeting some of you in person at these events where I'm going to be using creative writing and literature to address lived experiences of sexual violence. And I've literally just finished my second novel, which will hopefully be coming, well, it will be coming out early next year. So I look forward to continuing the conversation and to hearing some of your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Hello there, Winnie. Thank you so much for your presentation. I've just been monitoring some of the questions that have come through. There's a lot of people saying thank you so much for sharing your experience and your powerful testimony. We have a question from Emma who asks, do you have thoughts on how we can stop a 15-year-old boy, or indeed anyone, from committing acts of rape in the first place?
Yeah, oh, sorry, I will get to that question. Okay, I'm just realizing I saw the comment I have until 10:50, but I cut out a whole bunch of my speech to try to get it back to 10:40. But so I'll try to weave some of that in. How do we stop a 15-year-old boy? Oh my God. I mean, it's, this is the question that I tried to, answer or at least explore in my novel, because for me, nobody's born a rapist, right? I mean, I have a son now, and I really hope he's not going to grow up to be that, right? And I think every mother thinks that, right? So nobody's born with those impulses and that kind of behavior. So somehow that behavior is learned, right? And clearly it happened to my perpetrator if by the age of 15 he was that violent. So it could be a number of things. In my novel I suggested pornography, and he was in an abusive family, and he had an older brother who was abusive towards women, and he never had any kind of quite positive relationships with any women in his family. So or with girls outside the family either. So it's a lot of it's what you're exposed to, and maybe the culture that you live in, and how the culture views gender, and access to women's bodies. So I'm not a forensic psychologist, so I can't answer those things. But as an author, I tried to use fiction to kind of imagine that. But for me, also, it was important to imagine my rapist as also as a 15-year-old who has a lot of the same fears that a 15-year-old has, and a lot of the same wants, who maybe hopes that his older brother spent more time with him. So maybe being violent is his way of getting attention or something like that, because I think it's also important just to realize that rapists aren't monsters as much as the media tries to make them out to be as monsters that, live outside the realm of human normality. Rapists live among us. They live in our families. They are people that we date and are in relationships with, and they're in our workplaces. And a lot of rapists probably go undetected. So I think it's important to realize that there's a sheen of normality, and then behind that there can be these behaviors. And I think the behaviors come from certain attitudes that are learned, and if those behaviors aren't addressed and held accountable for, they will continue and they will impact other people's lives. So for me, it was quite sad when I suppose one of the reasons the rape happened is because I never even suspected this 15-year-old boy that I was speaking to could be dangerous, right? So there was that. There's the element of surprise, I suppose, right? But then, for the longest time, it was so incongruous for me to realize I'd been raped by somebody who was half my age, because I was like, how could somebody that young be that violent? But clearly it happens, and it happens, younger children do those behaviors as well. And so I think that's why it's so important from the beginning, from when a child is raised in their family and when they go to school, and all the messages that are sent to them through the media, that they realize that women's bodies, other people's bodies, sexual consent needs to be respected, and that the impacts can be that massive if they aren't respected.
Thank you for that, Winnie. We've got a couple of questions in around media, because you did touch upon that and its effect. People talking about there is media guidelines, but is there a place for victims and survivors to actually input on those? And what do you think the media have to do to make this better, to fix because there's clearly something askew there in reportage?
Yeah, I mean, I think things have certainly changed now. I hope so, right? Because my rape happened in 2008, right? And then obviously in 2017, we had actually the same year my novel came out. There was the whole #MeToo movement, which has had an impact, because I think it's made everybody in society much more aware of how we talk about these things, these issues, right? So I think a lot, for example, a lot of movies that are made today are getting much more mindful. Movies and TV shows are made much more mindful of how they portray sexual consent and assault than movies from the 80s, right? So I think that has also crossed over into reportage, into news reporting as well. I work with a charity called On Road Media, and they're based in London, and their specific goal is to kind of reframe the way that sexual assault and domestic abuse are spoken about in the media by kind of fostering relationships between survivors and experts, I suppose, and frontline workers and journalists. Bearing in mind, of course, many journalists themselves may also have experiences, and that may cause them to want to report on these issues. But yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be more accountability for bad reporting, and I think a lot of times reporting isn't even, I mean, journalists are very harried, right? There's always deadlines, and they don't have a lot of time to stop and think about things. So I think sometimes they don't realize that things that they do can be impactful. So every time I engage with the media, I always have to be like, make sure you call me a survivor, not a victim. I mean, that's my personal thing. I know some people do want to be called victims. I may have a great interview with a really understanding journalist. Like, for example, I did a radio interview, but then when the radio interview was put out onto the internet, the headline was "Rape Shame Prevented Me from Talking to My Parents," right? And I was like, and that wasn't the fault of the journalist. That was the fault of the sub editor who maybe just thought rape shame would be a very clickable, headline. So there is that thing that tendency towards salaciousness and putting the word rape in there, and shame and things like that, and sex, right? My perpetrator was once referred to as a sex beast in one of the articles about him, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting, a sex beast. So that kind of tendency to want to have very clickable headlines can actually be quite dehumanizing. So I think the media does need to be held more accountable, and some of it comes from people like me speaking, and some of it comes from charities and other organizations that are responsible for holding the media to account. But then I think we also, as consumers of the media, need to be critical about it as well and say like, okay, that's a bit dodgy, that reporting, right? And also just kind of always think about the human story behind those news stories. That all the statistics that are spoken about, the wee Chinese girl who's raped in the forest, right? That's a real person who had a life before and will have a life in the future.
Yeah, no, I think that you make a really good point there about how, at the end of the day, these headlines are there because people click on them. And, we all do have to take responsibility as well. And also, I think it was touched upon yesterday in day one of our conference about how, positive storylines that unpick those myths and stereotypes and things in like, soaps and film and things like that. They're what really help with cultural change. So, the career that you started in film production can actually be a really valuable tool there. We're pretty much running out of time. So thank you everyone for your questions. And thank you, Winnie, for answering them. But I'm going to pass back over to Brenda now for the next session in our panel. So thank you.